There is a quiet grief carried by those who outgrow the people and places that once shaped them. It is not loud or chaotic. It lives in the gentle spaces between who they used to be and who they are becoming. Growth feels beautiful from afar, but up close it often feels like a soft breaking, a separation not born from anger, but from evolution. One day they wake up and find that the world they once depended on no longer feels like home. The voices they used to trust no longer echo what their heart understands. The familiar rooms of their past feel smaller, as if the walls remained the same size while they quietly expanded inside. This grief does not announce itself. It whispers through moments of nostalgia, through the ache of remembering a self that no longer fits, through the awareness that transformation always asks for something in return. Chapter 1. First Signs of Dynasty and Seeth. The beginning of outgrowing someone rarely feels dramatic. It arrives gently, almost kindly, as a shift so subtle it goes unnoticed. A conversation that once felt comforting now feels hollow. An old routine that used to offer belonging now feels constrictive. The laughter shared with someone close feels slightly out of rhythm, as if both hearts are beating to different tempos. These signs are not loud enough to alarm anyone. They appear in tiny moments, passing through the day like a wind that changes direction without warning. What once felt natural begins to require effort. Words that flowed effortlessly start feeling like translations of a language you are slowly forgetting. You listen to someone you once shared everything with, and you feel the distance between their world and your own widening quietly. Nothing is wrong, yet nothing feels quite right. You are not sure when this shift began. Perhaps it started when your inner world deepened in ways you never anticipated. Perhaps it began the moment you realized your dreams now stretched farther than the map you once created with them. Or maybe it began the first time you felt misunderstood in a way you could not explain. You start noticing that conversations remain on the surface while your heart longs for depth. You feel yourself shrinking in order to fit the spaces you once grew comfortably in. Something in you hesitates. Something in you tries to stay loyal to the past. But another part, the quiet one you often ignore, whispers that you are becoming someone your old world does not entirely recognize. And this creates a soft sadness. A sadness for the version of yourself who once felt perfectly at home in those old connections. A sadness for the ease that no longer exists. A sadness for relationships that have not broken, but simply stopped growing with you. You want to pretend nothing has changed. You want to keep holding on to the familiarity of those connections. But the distance continues to expand, not out of conflict, but out of life itself. People imagine outgrowing others as abandonment. But in truth, it feels more like standing at a doorway between two seasons. One season shaped you, nurtured you, protected you. The other calls you toward becoming the person you are quietly unfolding into. You stand between them, feeling the pull of both. You do not want to leave anyone behind, yet you cannot ignore the new self rising inside you, asking for space to breathe. This is where the first grief begins to grow. In the realization that you cannot keep stretching yourself thin to remain small for others. In the recognition that your yearning for growth creates a silence between you and the people who once felt like your entire world. This silence is not unkind. It is simply honest. And in that honesty, you begin to feel the earliest ache of outgrowing what once held you so closely. Chapter 12, where outgrowing BG and its outgrowing others does not happen overnight. It begins deep within, shaped by experiences that slowly reshape a person's inner landscape. People often assume growth as a sudden awakening, but most growth begins quietly, as a series of tiny emotional shifts that accumulate until something inside you changes permanently. For many, outgrowing others begins in childhood, when they learn to adapt to environments that do not nurture their emotional needs, when they learn to read the atmosphere of a room before they learn to read their own feelings, when they learn to carry others' expectations before they learn how to carry their own desires. Children who grow up like this often become adults who outgrow people rapidly because their emotional world deepens faster than their relationships can keep up with. Others begin outgrowing their environment when they discover parts of themselves they once buried: creativity, sensitivity, ambition, self-awareness. Once these parts start waking up, they expand the inner world rapidly. Old relationships built on shared limitations cannot stretch far enough to hold these expanding truths. They remain tied to the older version of you, the one who fit neatly within their expectations. They love who you were, but they may not understand who you are becoming. Outgrowing people often begins when you stop abandoning yourself. When you begin choosing rest over burnout, honesty over masking, depth over distraction, peace over chaos, your emotional threshold increases, and the relationships that once felt fulfilling now feel incomplete, not because they are flawed, but because you are evolving beyond the emotional agreements they were built upon. For some, outgrowing others begins when they experience their first taste of emotional safety, when they meet someone or encounter a moment that shows them what genuine connection can feel like. Once the heart feels sincerity, depth, and understanding, it can no longer return to environments that only offer half-hearted presence. Growth begins the moment you realize what you deserve, and grief begins the moment you realize most people cannot meet you where you are going. Sometimes outgrowing others begins when you face parts of yourself you avoided for years. Healing forces you to confront your past, your wounds, your patterns. As you soften into this self-honesty, you find that some people are connected to the version of you who stayed wounded because it made you easier to keep close. When you heal, you change the dynamic. The relationship no longer fits the new emotional alignment you carry. Whatever the origin, outgrowing someone is never rooted in arrogance or superiority. It is born from emotional expansion. It is the natural evolution of a heart learning to understand itself more deeply. It is a shift that happens internally long before it becomes visible externally. You do not choose to outgrow people. You simply become someone who can no longer shrink back into who you were. This realization carries its own sorrow, because growth requires shedding, and shedding requires letting go. You begin to see that your path demands solitude at times, and solitude demands courage. Outgrowing others is not a betrayal. It is the quiet unfolding of a self finally returning home to its truth. Chapter 3's Psychology of Becoming Someone New. The process of outgrowing others is not merely emotional. It is biological, cognitive, and deeply psychological. The brain changes as you evolve, rewiring itself as your identity expands. Neural pathways shaped by old environments begin to weaken, while new pathways strengthen in response to newfound perspectives and emotional experiences. When the brain encounters growth, it starts building new associations with safety. What once felt familiar may no longer feel aligned with the beliefs, values, and emotional needs emerging within you. This creates a subtle internal shift. The old world becomes less regulating. The new world becomes more soothing. People often misunderstand this shift as losing interest. In truth, it is the nervous system searching for deeper coherence. Psychology explains that outgrowing others often mirrors the process of identity integration. The self goes through internal reorganizations each time you reach a deeper level of self. Your priorities shift, your emotional boundaries strengthen, your capacity for self-reflection increases. With every shift, relationships that do not evolve with you begin to fade naturally. The brain also responds to emotional mismatch. When conversations no longer stimulate your inner growth, the mind begins to disengage. When relationships operate on outdated emotional patterns, the heart begins to feel unseen. When people remain attached to your former self, the body experiences subtle stress each time. You must suppress your new truths to maintain harmony. This leads to emotional exhaustion disguised as distance. The psychology of outgrowing others also connects to attachment patterns. As you heal, your attachment style may evolve. You may seek more authenticity, more emotional reciprocity, more stability, but not everyone in your life can meet you at this new level. Some remained attached to the version of you who tolerated chaos or lack of depth. When your attachment shifts, your relationships must shift too. Some adapt, others dissolve. Another psychological factor is narrative expansion. As you grow, your internal story becomes richer. You begin asking deeper questions. You seek meaning. You explore your inner world with honesty. People who remain unchanged may still carry narratives rooted in earlier chapters of life. When your story expands and theirs remains the same, the emotional distance naturally increases. The grief arises because your emotional world continues to evolve, but not everyone is willing or capable of evolving with you. Their slowness is not a fault. Your expansion is not a betrayal. It is simply the nature of growth. It requires movement, and movement creates separation. Psychologically, becoming someone new means you cannot return to the level of awareness you once had. Once the mind widens, it cannot shrink back. Once the heart softens, it cannot pretend it feels nothing. Once the soul awakens, it cannot return to sleep. You are shifting from one internal reality to another. And with that shift comes the silent loss of relationships built on your older self. This is where the hidden grief deepens. Not because you do not love the people you once needed, but because you now understand the emotional distance that growth inevitably creates. You are not losing them out of disregard. You are losing them out of evolution. And the psychology of becoming someone new means you must accept that growth will cost you the comfort of your former world. Chapter 4. Quiet conflict between staying and becoming. The most painful part of outgrowing someone is the inner conflict it creates. A conflict between loyalty and authenticity. Between staying where you have history and moving toward where your soul feels drawn. It is not a simple decision. It is an emotional tug-of-war that stretches the heart in opposite directions. You feel guilt for changing. You feel guilt for desiring depth that others cannot give. You feel guilt for wanting to leave what once felt familiar. But alongside that guilt, there is longing. Longing for emotional resonance. Longing for spaces where you feel understood. Longing for relationships that reflect who you are now, not who you used to be. This conflict becomes a quiet storm inside you. On one side is the comfort of the past, the people who once made you feel safe, the routines that shaped your early sense of self. On the other is the undeniable truth that the person you are becoming no longer fits these old emotional agreements. You try to hold on, but holding on requires shrinking. Shrinking requires self-abandonment, and self-abandonment is a cost you can no longer afford. You begin negotiating with yourself. You tell yourself to stay patient. You tell yourself to compromise. You tell yourself to ignore the subtle ache each time you feel misunderstood. But your inner world keeps expanding, and every attempt to silence this expansion only deepens the internal conflict. You begin to feel disconnected, not only from others, but from yourself. There is also a resistance to grief. Outgrowing someone feels like losing a part of your identity. You grieve the memories. You grieve the comfort. You grieve the version of yourself who once belonged effortlessly. You fear that letting go means dismissing the role they played in your life. It does not. But the mind struggles to accept this truth while navigating emotional transition. The conflict deepens when others sense your growth but do not understand it. They may accuse you of changing too much. They may say you are distant, selfish, different, and in some ways you are. But your difference is not a rejection of them. It is a response to the evolution unfolding within you. Part of the conflict arises from the belief that love is proven through staying. But growth teaches you that sometimes love is proven through letting go without anger, through acknowledging the truth without guilt, through honoring your path without requesting others to change theirs. The grief lies in realizing that staying would mean betraying your becoming, and leaving means grieving your belonging. This is the quiet conflict of growth. You must choose the version of yourself you will honor, and each choice carries both loss and liberation. Chapter 5. Moment you know you cannot go back. There comes a moment when the internal shift becomes irreversible. A moment when you realize that the emotional distance between you and your past is no longer temporary, but permanent. This moment rarely feels dramatic. It does not arrive with a sudden explosion of truth. It appears quietly, like a soft click inside the heart. Perhaps it arrives during a conversation where you suddenly feel like a stranger. Perhaps it appears when you return to a familiar place and find that everything feels smaller than you remember. Perhaps it emerges when someone from your past speaks to you as if you are still the person you used to be, and you realize you no longer relate to that version of yourself. Or maybe the moment appears while sitting alone, recognizing that the people who once held you up can no longer walk the emotional distance required to meet you. This moment is not an act of judgment. It is an act of recognition. You see clearly that the bridge connecting your past to your present has thinned. You understand that no amount of nostalgia can bring you back to who you were. Growth has changed your emotional architecture. You have gained layers of insight, clarity, and truth that your old world cannot hold. In this moment, something inside you exhales, not out of relief, but out of acceptance. You realize that returning would mean dimming the light you worked so hard to uncover. You realize that going back would mean forcing yourself into the emotional shape of a person you no longer are, and the heart cannot unknow what it has discovered about itself. The grief in this moment is sharp but quiet. It is the grief of knowing that some relationships will slowly fade, not out of neglect, but out of emotional misalignment. It is the grief of understanding that not everyone who was part of your past is meant to be part of your future. It is the grief of accepting that love can exist without longevity, and closeness can exist without permanence. But alongside this grief is a clarity that feels both painful and freeing. You begin to see that your path is expanding in ways that require space. You sense the new relationships waiting on the horizon. Relationships built not on old survival patterns, but on your current emotional truth. You realize that the next version of your life cannot grow in soil that no longer nourishes you. This moment marks the transition from mourning the past to embracing the becoming. It is the moment you understand that growth and loss often walk hand in hand. And once this realization settles into your bones, you know you cannot go back, not because you are too good for your past, but because you have finally outgrown the version of yourself who needed it. Chapter 6: When Grief Meets Self-Return. Healing after outgrowing people is not loud or triumphant. It is quiet, steady, and deeply personal. It begins with recognizing how much of yourself you left behind in old relationships. You start noticing the parts of your identity that dimmed to maintain connection, the opinions you softened, the dreams you delayed, the emotions you concealed. You begin to realize how much space you surrendered to stay within the limits of others. Comfort. Grief meets healing when you finally turn inward and reclaim the pieces of yourself that were once neglected. You start honoring your emotional depth instead of hiding it. You start valuing your boundaries instead of apologizing for them. You start speaking in the language of your inner world instead of translating yourself into simplicity for others to understand. This return to yourself is gentle. You do not rush it. You do not demand closure. You simply begin listening to the parts of you that were silent during your years of shrinking. You let them speak. You let them guide you. You let them breathe. As this healing unfolds, you gain clarity about your needs. You see the relationships that nourished you and the ones that drained you. You recognize that not all connections are meant to last a lifetime. Some are meant to accompany you through a single chapter. Others are meant to teach you lessons about who you are becoming. When you accept this truth, grief softens into gratitude. The return to yourself also means creating space for new relationships that align with your growing emotional landscape. People who value depth instead of distraction. People who understand silence and vulnerability. People who love you, not for the version of yourself you used to be, but for the truth of who you are now. Healing is not about replacing old relationships quickly. It is about understanding what your heart can no longer tolerate. It is about recognizing that being understood is a form of love. It is about honoring the emotional standards you once ignored for the sake of belonging. As you return to your own heart, the grief begins transforming. It stops feeling like a wound and becomes a reminder of how far you have come. You realize that outgrowing others was not a sign of losing love, but of learning how to love yourself more honestly. Chapter 7: Softer Way of Carrying Forward. With time, the grief settles into a quiet wisdom. You begin to understand that outgrowing people is not cruelty. It is not betrayal. It is a natural part of becoming the person you were always meant to be. You learn to hold the past gently, without resentment. You learn to honor the memories, without needing to resurrect the relationships. You learn that growth does not erase love. It simply reshapes where love belongs. You carry forward a deeper compassion. Compassion for your younger self who tried so hard to stay small. Compassion for the people who could not grow with you. Compassion for the chapters that ended before you were ready. You begin to understand that each connection served its purpose, even if its purpose was temporary. The further you walk into your becoming, the more you realize that you did not lose anything. You evolved beyond it. You did not abandon your past. You simply stepped into a future that required a fuller version of you. And those who were meant to continue with you are already meeting you. Where you now stand, the story does not end with loneliness. It ends with clarity. You recognize that the world expands each time you expand. New relationships appear when the heart creates space. New understanding emerges as the mind grows. New peace settles in as you align with your truth. The hidden grief transforms into a quiet acceptance. You were never meant to stay the same. You were meant to evolve, to unfold, to rise into your wider self. And those you once needed were not stepping stones, but sacred companions in earlier chapters of your becoming. As you move forward, you carry them not as weights, but as memories that softened you. You no longer fear outgrowing others. You understand now that this is simply the soul's way of growing toward the life it is finally ready to live.